Okay, in this session, we are going to learn about Agile. And in Agile software development methodologies, there are few methodologies are there. We will basically go over few of them. Primarily, we'll focus on Scrum. So in this session, we will learn the introduction of Agile methodologies, and we will talk about the Agile Framework, Agile Manifestos, and we will also focus on common characteristics of Agile that is applicable to all the methodologies, and what is the Agile value proposition, and why it is so important, and why it is preferred actually in the industry. And we will also talk about the Scrum in detail. What is a Scrum and what is a Scrum life cycle? What are the key characteristics and key terminologies in the Scrum? Okay, so this is all about the Agile. Okay, let me start with the introduction. If you see in the introduction, in the Agile, it's an methodology that is an approach to the project management. This is one of the approach basically. It is typically used in the software development. It helps the team to respond to the unpredictability of the building of software through incremental iterative work cadence known as sprint. Again, the sprint is the every iterations are known as a sprint. So that terminology will be used in the Scrum as well. So we will build the application or the software or the product sprint by sprint. Okay, and a sprint is basically a part of your release. So and every sprint consists of 2 to 4 weeks of a work, depending on which the features or functionalities or the requirement you will pick up. Okay, so typically that's the timeline we can consider for the sprint. Then we'll talk about there are the group of software development methodologies that are based on the principle of iterative development, where the requirement evolved through collaboration between self-organizing cross-functional team. Now, this is basically what we talk about in the Agile. It is highly interactive, basically, the approach where we we will define the requirement in the form of product backlog. Okay, so it's and we will list all the requirement also may be known as the user stories, in the form of user stories. And we will see those examples of the user stories and what are the characteristics of the user stories and how they are written. Okay, so those are the user stories are typically your requirement. Those put it into the product backlog, and when you pick up those user stories or the requirement for a particular sprint, then when it at the time when you are building uh, when you are developing those requirements, you are interacting with the business as well as the stakeholders simultaneously. Okay, it is an approach to the project management typically used in the software development. So let's go to the Agile framework. Now, when we talk about the Agile framework, they have several methodologies within that. Some of them are listed here, like extreme programming, Scrum, Lean software development, that is LSD, feature-driven development, that is FDD, dynamic system development method, that is DSDM, Agile Unified Process AUP, adaptive software development, that is ASD, and Kanban. So these are some of the basically Agile framework. But as I mentioned earlier, the among the Agile, Scrum is been most popular, and people are also using the Kanban nowadays. Okay, so we will learn about this Scrum in detail. Okay. Now comes to the Agile Manifesto. Now, when we talk about the Agile Manifesto, it talks about basically individuals and informal interaction over the process and tools. These are the basically prime characteristic of the Agile. So you will find it is more of informal and less details. and they focus more on the basically working software over comprehensive documentations. If you see in the RUP and Waterfall, we have seen there is extensive documentations are there. Here, the documentations while developing will be less, but post implementation there will be detailed documentations. Okay. Then we have as a customer collaboration over contract negotiation. So here the developers or the technical team will be working very closely with the customer or the users, and to ensure that their needs are basically considered while developing a product or the solution, and less about the contract negotiations. So that's basically the one of the major Agile Manifesto. And we talk about basically Agile is very popular because of the way the change are handled. It's very easy to manage the change in the Agile. It responds to the change over following a plan. So if you see every sprint, we pick up some requirement and we deploy. The users are allowed to add their requirement or the user story at any time during the life cycle, and at the end of the sprint the product owner and the team will basically reprioritize all the user stories or the requirement in the product backlog. It is not necessary when you add a particular user story. You can add at the beginning, you can add at the middle, but depending on the priority of that particular user story or the requirement, the that it will be picked up in the next sprint. Okay, so that way the all the high priority requirements are always been taken care of at the early stage in the Agile. Okay. And Agile methodology is an approach to the project management typically used in software development. Again, it is a little bit of a repeating. It helps the team to respond to the unpredictability of the building software through incremental iterative work cadence known as sprint. If you remember earlier session, we have talked about if there is any changes are there and any improvement need to be done for the previous sprint, that can be done while the next sprint is in the process. So while implementing, you can implement both the sprint, the new sprint you can deploy, and also the improved version of the previous sprint is possible. So you can basically accommodate the changes at any given time. The Agile software development is a group of software development methodology based on iterative incremental development where the requirements and the solution evolve through the collaboration between self-organizing cross-functional team. I don't know who has made this slide, but a little bit repeated information here. Now the common characteristic of all those Agile methodologies or the framework what we've seen here, the common characteristic of the Agile is basically they have a small team size that is 2 to 12, and throughout the project life cycle they have a formal communication. It could be like stand-up meetings, or it could be just email communication or the bullet points or just a user stories, and that way it is informal communication. Or if you compare that previously what we discussed, the requirement will be put into the template, that's a business requirement document or functional requirement document, and those are very extensive documentation which go through few revisions and presented that to the several stakeholders before it is approved and taken for the development or the next for the processing. Okay, but in this Agile, the lengthy process is not followed. Okay, and informal change management here, since as we see the product owner is the owner of the basically project, and he will decide how the change has to be, which requirement has higher the priority and which change has to be managed. And the change is informal, means any change can be basically initiated at any stage, and that if the change is valid from the team perspective, it will basically will be developed. Okay, depending on its priority during the phase. So we don't have the extensive change control board and the approval process, acceptance, rejection, approval process, and the feedback and all that process is not here. So it becomes easier to handle the change and address the new requirement which have been introduced at any stage of the project development. Okay, and it has an informal requirement management process, as I just was mentioning. This is again addressing to the same thing. Informal communication, it means that we may have the email or stand-up meeting and those kind of communication, but we also, the requirement also will have that user stories or the product backlog, and that is how the requirements are captured, rather than capturing into the planning, elicitation, confirmation, presentation, and viewing, and that's the whole process is basically shortened in few steps. Okay, and earlier it was used with a relatively smaller and a less complex project, but now it is used in the large and the complex project as well. Okay, so that's the basically common characteristic, and these are applicable to all these the framework which we talked about. So these are common for all these framework. The next slide, I'm going to talk about the value proposition. If you see here, it is mentioning the agile development value proposition. This is very important slide. Let me basically increase slightly. Yeah. Okay. If you see that red line, red and a little bit thick, so this is basically agile, and the dotted one is basically what we talk about the traditional development. Okay, so in the first graph you see it talks about the visibility, the vertical, that y-axis is visibility, x-axis is a time. Okay, so over a period of time what it is. So what it means that visibility at the initial stage of the project, that is very close to the zero on the x-axis, it's very high, both whether it is a traditional or agile. But visibility stays high throughout the agile, throughout the life cycle in the agile, but visibility, if you see, drastically goes down in the traditional, but it again again basically improves or gain the momentum at the last stage, and then visibility is again high here. So during this phase, like in the middle phase when the development, testing, and UAT is happening, right? At the time, visibility will be very less. So the stakeholders or the sponsors may not know much about what's exactly happening in detail. But when the whole product or the solution is implemented or ready for implementation, suddenly visibility goes higher. But that's not the case in the agile. Agile is developed iteratively and incrementally, so you will see the visibility will go up and down, but it stays high because every we it is iterative and incremental process. So after every iteration, when there is a deployment is taking place, at the time it goes into the user community, that particular requirement or the features or functionality. So again the visibility is high. Again there is a slightly dips when there is a the sprint is in the process. Okay, when again when sprint is deployed and that we are ready for the new sprint, again visibility goes high. Okay, that way it stays basically at a very high. Next talks about the adaptability. It talks about the adaptability is a very high at initial stage. It means that we are ready to accept the changes to the solution, and we are ready to basically change the course, okay, if required, and the changes to the requirement or the design is possible. So it is adaptability is high for both traditional as well as agile. Okay, but if you see that the traditional adaptability dips down very drastically and stays very low. So it means that the changes to the solution at later stage is more difficult. So it is not very adaptive or it is not very flexible. Okay, but in case of agile, the adaptability dips little, but still it is stays at certain high level. So it is still adaptable. It means you can introduce the new requirement, You can change the design if required, and you can add or remove the user stories at any stage. So that way you can basically handle the changes, okay, to the requirement or to the solution. So that is what we say the adaptability stays high. The third graph, you see that in the business value. In this case, if you see the business value at the initial stage, whether it is a traditional or agile, is very little, okay, almost zero, right? But business value for traditional, it stays less or the minimum for a very long time, and when the whole solution is ready and it is implemented, then business value goes up. That is when the solution is fully functional, and it takes some time basically to reach to the peak, okay. So that is what we talk about the business value. It means that you are start going to generate the revenue only after you implement the entire solution and it stays here. But that is not the case in the agile. Although business value is very low or the minimum at the initial stage, but it basically picks up. It means that when you start implementing the sprint or deploying a sprint and user starts using it, so that's where the business value is realized. You may basically start generating the revenue at early stage. So this is how it picks up at certain stage, and then it basically stays high and reaches to the peak. It means that we start implementing our the sprint, and once the sprint goes live or goes into the user community, then users start using it, and that is how the value is realized, okay. And this is building by you know um, sprint by sprint, okay. So that is how the user. So if you remember that our example, what we talked about, uh, the, the travel portal, when we say that if you use the agile methodology at early stage, maybe within 6 months or 8 months, you have the flight booking ready and customer service and the payment gateway. So at least one particular the features is available to the customers, and that's where you start generating the revenue. Then you can add additional features or functionality like hotel booking, car booking, holiday booking, and that's how you start building the solution. But you start also generating the revenue at early stage, right? So this is the difference really. Okay, in terms of the risk, if you say in the traditional and the agile, the risk is very high at the initial stage, okay, and the risk stays high in the traditional for a very long time. But when it is deployed and you goes into the user community, and once it's settled down, it will go down quickly, okay. But this it risk stays high because we don't know how a solution will behave in the user community, how the user community will respond to the solution, whether their requirement will basically be taken care of, or there are any additional dependency will be mm, there, so those uncertainties are there, so that's the reason the risks are very high. But in agile, although risk is very high at initial stage, it goes down sharply, okay. It means once we start uh, deploying a sprint, and with each sprint the risk will go down and down, and then it stays low at some stage, okay, when the users start basically responding to the features or functionalities of the sprint, and when it settles down into the solution settles down into the user community. So this is basically what we talk about the value proposition, and that's one reason is why agile has become more popular. Now coming to the Scrum now, let me just talk about. Scrum is basically a lightweight management framework with the broad applicability for managing and controlling the iterative and incremental projects of all types. Now here they mention all types means small or big, okay. Ken Schwaber, Mike Biddle, Jeff Sutherland, and others have contributed significantly to the evolution of Scrum over the last decade. Okay, this is the little bit of a history. The additional point I would like to make: Scrum is basically word come from a rugby game. It means that short-term strategies. Short-term strategies, if you see that every uh, part of the game is over, then you'll see all the players are basically together, and then they discuss about the next move. Same thing in the cricket. If you see that short-term strategy is basically only um, uh, for one over. It means that whoever is a batsman and whoever is a bowler, based on their the stat based on their style of playing, that strategy is built. How to build the fielding, and that's basically been discussed. Once the over is finished, again that the fielding strategies change. So that's what we talk about, a very short-term strategy. Okay. And the same thing here, the scrum is basically strategy will keep changing after every sprint, and we adjust and improve for the ready for the improvement for the next sprint. Okay, so this is what we mean. This is basically a diagram which you will see in many places. What exactly the life cycle means is we create a product backlog, and the product backlog contains the user stories, or the requirements are stored, and that is nothing but a requirement bag. You can simply use an Excel sheet and list them, that's fine. Then we pick up few requirements, okay, to create a sprint. Sprint is nothing but an iteration. So we have to pick up some requirement on for the sprint, and those requirements, whichever you pick up for the sprint, that is called a sprint backlog. So that particular bag is called sprint backlog, and based on those backlog, the sprint, we create the planning for the sprint. We plan for that how it will be implemented, and it involves the product owner, scrum master. That scrum master is basically here plays a role of the project manager, okay, and the team. Then we execute the sprint. It means that we develop and test and deploy. That's a short, basically a cycle. So here the requirement, whatever the user stories you build, you have to again collaborate quickly with the users and see what the requirement means. You have the what is the requirement, but how the requirement should be deployed. So again you coordinate with the sprint, and you get the detailed requirement for the those requirement, the details of the requirement, and then you build the sprint and test it and deploy it. That's basically execute the sprint. During the sprint, you have a daily scrum meetings, and that's a stand-up meeting. Those are informal meeting basically, and it can be at the desk, or it can be in the meeting room, or it could be anywhere. Okay, so those are the basically scrum meetings, and then you have is a scrum master to remove the impediments. So you do have a scrum master who will basically help you or guide you, and if there are any issues are there, they will help them to resolve them. Okay, and during the scrum meeting, three questions are asked: what did I do yesterday or before that sprint? Okay, and what I intend to do today. Okay, and what are the impediments? So these are the three questions are asked and answered by everyone. Okay, so everyone knows what other person is doing, and the progress is tracked with the whiteboard or burn down chart. So we mentioned that okay, these are the requirement and what stage they are. I'm going to show them how the burn down chart looks like. Okay, then after end of the sprint, when all the requirements are successfully implemented, then we have is a sprint review meeting. So we have a demo and invite everyone, including the customers. Okay, and then we discuss about the sprint progress and the result, and then we also discuss with the customers to see whether the sprint has met its goal. If it is yes, then we could go ahead. Okay, and then post the sprint, there is also called something called sprint introspective meeting. So as we mentioned, this is very agile. So after every sprint, we change the strategy, or we try to improve the next for the next sprint. So what we do is here, it is we have to talk about what do we want to start doing, means something we have not done earlier, we want to introduce something new. And what then there is a second part is that what do we want to stop doing, something we did which created a problem or which was redundant or not useful, so we want to stop doing it. Okay, then we talk about what do we want to keep doing. What do we want to keep doing means what do we want to continue doing, so something which we did that worked well and we wish to continue, right? So these are the three items are basically discussed. That is how based on these three questions and based on the answers of these three questions the next sprint is basically created. Okay. Okay, here is a key concept we talked about. The product backlog is the where we store the requirement or the where we keep the user requirement. Okay, and a user story is nothing but a requirement. The role people will play is either Scrum Master, owner, and team. Scrum meeting we have three questions which we talked about earlier. What did I do yesterday? What I intend to do today? And what are the impediments I have faced? And a sprint means nothing but an iteration. Okay, or the small part of the project. Okay, and the sprint backlog is nothing but the requirement which we pick up in the sprint, and that's the place where we store the requirement. It could be an Excel sheet also. Okay. Sprint review meeting, as we talked about, post sprint implementation or execution, we will have the review meeting to review the progress, the result of the sprint. Okay. A sprint burn down chart is nothing but a progress chart, how the sprint basically been progressed. And then we have is a velocity of a sprint, it's nothing but a speed of the sprint. Okay, tracer bullet is nothing but basically difficulties. Here is the example what we have created for the user stories. If you see the user stories, the numbers and the stories, priority and estimation. Okay, so if you're looking at the priorities, if you see the mentioned 1, 2, 3, okay, and estimation are mentioned in the number of days. Okay, and if you see here the first one, as an authorized user, who I am, right? As an authorized user, I want to access what I want to do. That's answering the second question. Manage the beneficiary. Who, what, why? These are the questions have to be answered by user story. Who, what, why? As an authorized user, that's who. What, want to access. Why? I mean, what that is manage the beneficiary. Okay. As an authorized user, I want to add a beneficiary. Okay, then now let me take the example of F. As an authorized user, I want to download account statement, what I want to do, right? And how in the PDF form, right? Like that. So this is how the questions are answered in the three questions are answered in your user stories. Okay, now there are rules. Each user story adds a value to the user. Yes.
So for estimation of user story, means the time we mentioned is just for the implementation of story, or it includes development as well as testing time.
Development as well as implementation both. Okay, here it is development and testing. Development. So how long it takes to develop and test. This is also development and test. Completion means to complete a user story. Okay, it is just a given number. It could be much higher in the real life. Okay. Now here the rules when we talk. Each story adds a value to the user or customer. Each story is prioritized and developed in an order. Any team member can add a user story and delete story at any time during the project life cycle if it is not picked up in the sprint. If it is picked up in the sprint, then you can't do anything, but if it is in the product backlog you can do so. However, a sprint or iteration can't be changed by adding or removing any user stories in the sprint. that is being developed. It means once you pick up the user stories for the sprint for the development, then no changes is acceptable during the sprint. You can do it before the sprint or after the sprint. Okay. The product backlog is analyzed and reprioritized after every sprint. This is what we're talking about. Analyzed and reprioritized after every sprint. And based on the prioritization, the stories are selected for the development for the next sprint. That's why it is highly agile. So if you see, all the high priority requirement will be always been done at the early stage. Okay. The product backlog is updated during the entire project life cycle. Somebody may add a user story which they may think important, but in the project perspective, if it is not important, it will never be picked up, okay, at early stage. Only it will be picked up at the later stage when there is a time and the budget is left, okay, like that. All the user stories are estimated. All the user stories are completed within the expected time frame, and no low level tasks are added in the product backlog. Low level task means the details of the work is not added. For example, if you see here, the manage beneficiary. So we don't add the details about what exactly we want, what is the process of that, and all that part is not there. At the high level, it is mentioned. Okay. And once you start developing, at that time you interact with the users and get the details of the user stories. Now, this is basically a simple example of the Scrum or Kanban board, or you may call it as a storyboard. This is a very simple, but in the real life it can look very complicated. But to understand, I'm just created one. Say for example, in the product backlog, these are the stories are there, and they've been picked up for the development C, D, E, and these are delivered A and B. So hypothetically, A and B were part of the product backlog earlier. They were picked up at the first time and been delivered. And the second lot, the C and D and E is picked up. And then you have some stories in the product backlog. Okay. You can also create. Okay, so this is basically about the sprint. I think I wanted to show some more, but I don't think I have it. Okay. Let me check it. No, I don't have it. So I'm just going to give you a quick overview now. This is how the waterfall will look like to you. Okay, cascading effect, right? And this is how the spiral looked like. You, if you remember earlier, we talked about plan, assess the risk, build, and evaluate. This is how the RUP looked like: inception, elaboration, construction, transition, and the milestone during the basically RUP: life cycle objective, life cycle architecture, initial operational capability, product release. And this is how the Scrum will look like: product backlog, sprint, executive sprint, sprint review, and sprint retrospective. Okay. In the hybrid model, or the method can be used in the combination of traditional and modern approach. That is the combination of waterfall or RUP approach with one of the agile or the spiral approach to build a solution. It is done purely based on the understanding and the comfort of the level of your team. Okay. So this is the next we're talking about the comparative. Okay, the difference between the models which were talked about: traditional model, modern, and hybrid. It is also known as traditional, known as a predictive, predefined, plan-driven, sequential. The moderns are also known as dynamic, iterative, change-driven, adaptive. Now in the Bebok earlier they called as a plant driven and change driven, but now in the version number 2, but in version number 3 they mentioned it as a predictive and adaptive. So, but they both mean same. Okay, and in the hybrid it can be called as a combined or fusion. Okay, the process in the traditional, it is predefined process. In the modern it is as you go. So we keep changing the process as required. If you see the sprint also, we change the sprint, right? After sprint retrospective, we may change the course of the sprint in the next future sprints, right? Based on our experience with the customer and with our team, right? Team will change, customers will change based on that. The our one sprint experience we can change. So that is as you go. In the hybrid, overall project is predefined and each iteration are as you go, so that is possible. Okay. In the formality, in the traditional it is a very formal, modern it is informal, in the hybrid either way or semi-formal. Okay. And again it depends on the team and the stakeholders comfort, and also the organizational the process. Some of the organization expect you to have a very formal, expect you to follow the formal process when it comes to documentation, so that's where you have to check with that, what is the acceptable way. Communication, formal meeting templates and approval process, and in modern informal but written communication such as email, minutes of the meeting or requirement matrices are fine, but in hybrid, semi-formal or formal or informal depending on the project size and preferences. Okay. And in the requirement, in the traditional, requirements are defined, developed and delivered in a very formal way, and it is very process oriented, but in the modern they are defined and developed and delivered in informal way. In the hybrid, defined and delivered in a formal way, okay, but developed in informal way, so that's where the sprint, they will introduce a sprint. Examples: waterfall for the traditional, the for modern it is agile or spiral, and hybrid it will be RUP. So this is the end of your agile.